Hey all, I'm Webcamparrot, and as I mentioned at the end of my Mixie video, the final issue of Doomsday Clock has finally been published a whole year after it was originally supposed to come out. So now seems like the perfect time to do a video covering Dr. Manhattan's powers and greatest accomplishments. But as there is only so much you can say about Jonathan Osterman given his limited 30 or so appearances, I'm also going to touch on some story and character elements in a similar manner to my Swamp Thing video. Which is probably a good thing, because like many of Alan Moore's best characters, talking about their narrative and their powers comes hand in hand. It's very difficult to talk about the powers of Dr. Manhattan, or Swamp Thing for that matter, without explaining the deep narrative ties to either character. Now, if any of you are like me, you've been eagerly awaiting each issue of what is supposed to be a flagship comic of DC, and being disappointed with not only the delays, but also the quality of the content and its conflicting character interests. Well, I'm happy to say that any such doubts I had were wiped away by the final issue, which is almost a perfect end to the Doomsday Clock storyline. But even if John Osterman has a satisfying ending or a happy ending to his story, his beginning wasn't quite as clean. John was a fairly normal quantum physicist pushed into his line of work by his father until he was caught in one of the experiments at his lab where he was completely torn apart on a subatomic level. I believe the precise description of this is that his intrinsic field was removed. Now, this doesn't really mean anything scientifically. Intrinsic just means kind of fundamental or is necessary. So I think the most we can really infer from that is that this is at least some sort of subatomic destruction. Over the coming days after this accident, Osterman would learn to recreate his body, first only managing to make a nervous system, then meat and bones, and finally an entire body. He was given the name Dr. Manhattan, and in this new body he had access to a vast array of different abilities involving the arrangement of fundamental particles. From simple things like changing the colour of his own body to more complex tasks like teleporting individuals all across America. This teleportation isn't just limited to one person, however. He can send away entire groups of people if necessary. This is more than just simple teleportation, however, and is more than it seems, as Dr. Manhattan doesn't just transport the particles to their location. He quite literally bends all of space to place them there, or as Ozymandias put it in Before Watchmen, he prefers to move the universe rather than move himself. And that's an important thing to remember. Whenever you see Dr. Manhattan moving anybody, like teleporting them, he's actually moving the entire universe around them. Now, in the original Watchmen comic line, it seems that Dr. Manhattan can see both the future and the past, and he is incapable of changing either. But in the comic Before Watchmen, we see that he can actually travel backwards or forwards in time, and is capable of changing the course of events if he chooses to. Instead, he chooses to abandon his free will in order to repair the fractured timelines of the Watchmen universe that resulted from his decision to change past and future events. Essentially, Dr. Manhattan can determine any quantum state that exists, giving him a similar power to Yuha's Almighty from Bleach, as he can simply choose the outcome of any number of infinite quantum events, but chooses not to in character because of the destabilizing effect that it has on the universe. These powers have been clouded in the past though by the presence of tachyon swarms, which are essentially particles that travel backwards through time. As a result of this choice, Dr. Manhattan seems to be ageless as well, as his appearance is shaped purely by his own perception, which can no longer change because of his choice to give up free will. Dr. Manhattan's quantum powers also extend into matter manipulation and transmutation as well. He claimed to be capable of changing the nitrogen content in the soil across all of India to help combat the famine there, and has created things like lithium, oxygen, and glass on several different occasions. He can basically reshape any object he chooses, and this of course even extends to people with some quite disastrous results. Dr. Manhattan is also capable of moving objects around independently with something similar to telekinesis, and presumably uses this method to fly as well. Technology is of course a simple thing for him to manipulate, and he can even render his body intangible simply passing through things. Complementing these powers is a type of extrasensory perception, allowing John to see things normal humans cannot. He can directly observe neutrinos and was able to detect and track tachyon particles back to their source in Antarctica. Meaning that Dr. Manhattan doesn't just only see throughout all of time, he also precisely sees every minute detail at each and every moment. Manhattan has no problems changing his own body either. As I said earlier, he can change the colour of his skin, or even the size of his body, without any issues. However, all of these powers came with what you might consider a downside. John had lost his humanity, and was perfectly willing to commit terrible acts now that he was Dr. Manhattan, no longer seeing the difference between a corpse and a live human, as they have the same number of particles. His participation in the Vietnam War resulted in the loss of thousands of lives, ending the war in only 2 months. He stood by as the comedian gunned down a pregnant woman, with the comedian directly commenting on John's fading humanity. America even had to negotiate for Dr. Manhattan to be excluded from the Geneva Convention because of the many acts he had already committed and presumably would commit in service of the United States in the future. It isn't until much later in Watchmen where we see that Laurie is finally able to convince, or around about, John, in her own way, that human life does have a value. This essentially leads to John eventually choosing to kill Rorschach to prevent the greater loss of life that would come from letting him live. At the end of this storyline, we see Dr. Manhattan say he's going to travel to another galaxy. Then, in the Before Watchmen comic line, we see him create new life in the waters of some faraway planet. Eventually, however, his journey would take him far further than simply another galaxy. He would travel into the multiverse of DC, finding his way to Prime Earth, which is where the Doomsday Clock storyline begins, as well as New 52. And Manhattan is yet again forced to re-evaluate his views on the world. He travelled to the DC multiverse, the realm of real superheroes, to join them. Perhaps the only place he could truly fit in. His plans would change, however, once he saw what the future had in store for him. He would foresee a future encounter with Superman that left Manhattan with nothing but a vision of pitch black, leading John to believe that Superman either kills him or that Manhattan destroys everything. John would spend most of the comic looking for some kind of solution to this, some way to remove Superman from the multiverse or change the course of events leading up to his vision, creating the New 52 continuity as a result. He continued to fail at this task, however, and could never truly remove Superman, eventually coming to the conclusion that hope would fade from the multiverse. He received several far more impressive feats during the story, as well as showing off some of his pre-established powers at a higher level. He displayed the ability to show visions to others, like when he brought Firestorm back to the accident that created him. Dr. Manhattan was capable of simply looking at Ozymandias to determine that he didn't have cancer. In one storyline, Mixie even goes directly out of his way to imply that Dr. Manhattan is far more powerful than the fifth dimensional imp is. This is only an implication, however, Mixie claims that he did not create Infinite Planet, and that the memory erasing effects it produces, as well as the realm itself, were created by a being far beyond his scope. At the end of the comic, we see a clear reference to Manhattan and the upcoming events of Doomsday Clock, when we get this zoom-in shot on Mars, where Dr. Manhattan obviously is. This much I do agree with. I think this is a pretty clear indication that Dr. Manhattan is stronger than Mixie, and that's what Mixie is talking about in the comic. But there's another moment that I do not agree with. And this is essentially where we see two blue ghosts empower Jonathan Kent to defeat Mixie. Now, some people use this to say, oh, it's Manhattan empowering him, but as we see later in the story, these blue spiritual ghosts are actually a representation of Lois and Clark. This, in my opinion, is supposed to be a representation of the power of the story of Superman itself, which Mixie was getting in the way of by tampering with their memories. Essentially, he was trying to make Clark and Lois forget their partnership together and forget about the child that they had had. Not only has the story of Superman been directly shown to be beyond Manhattan, as he couldn't get rid of Superman no matter what he did, but the story of Superman is repeatedly referenced throughout other source material in a similar manner. From Superman Where Is Thy Sting, when he directly defeated the embodiment of his own death and survived the death of everything in creation, or in Milk Wars, when Retcon Corporation couldn't alter the narrative of Superman, or when the literal story of Superman became the cosmic armor Superman and directly started beating the tar out of Mandrake. Like, Superman is seriously just so OP, guys. You have not... Okay, sorry, this is a Dr. Manhattan video, not a Superman video, but you guys get the idea. It's the story of Superman that defeated Mixie, not Manhattan. Later on in Doomsday Clock proper, Lex Luthor would go on to tell Lois Lane that Dr. Manhattan was a force undermining all of creation, which lines up with some of Mixie's best feats as well, who has repeatedly been shown as a threat to all of creation. If you're curious about just how powerful Mixie is, I recommend you go ahead and watch my Mixie video that came out a couple of weeks ago, and if you're confused as to what I mean by creation, then my DC Multiverse video should elucidate you on that. Dr. Manhattan's best stuff, by far, however, comes when the massive group of heroes, practically every hero on Earth, comes to confront him. Guy Gardner even goes as far as to directly compare Manhattan to numerous other villains the heroes have defeated before, like Darkseid and the Anti-Monitor. Dr. Manhattan seems unfazed, however, and eventually Guy Gardner lashes out at him with his Green Lantern powers, actually managing to hit John somehow, seemingly snapping his neck and killing him. But it's a simple matter for Manhattan to recreate his body, where he then proceeds to smack every hero there, starting with Gardner, when he takes his ring and disassembles it right in front of him. Zatanna and Etrigan attempt to launch their magic at him, only for Manhattan to disarm them, calling it power from the scraps of creation, which is a dumb and wrong statement, but he did it regardless. It's just wrong because of the numerous statements for magic coming from a realm known as the Shadowlands, and not being scraps of creation, as the Shadowlands obviously lies outside of creation, it being the realm that the great evil beast fled to when creation pushed it out. Either way, he then goes on to directly use the same magical powers himself to launch an attack, taking out the Flash, Hawkgirl, Martian Manhunter and Aquaman all at the same time. Numerous other heroes launched their attacks to no success until Captain Atom, the original inspiration for Dr. Manhattan, who probably deserves his own video, is able to tear John apart, only for John to pull his usual trick of recreating his body. After this, he goes to incapacitate the rest of the heroes, seeming to put them to sleep or in some other paralysis-like state. The Justice League, the Green Lanterns, and the Bat Family were all defeated this way, as well as various others. Notably, Justice League Dark and the Doom Patrol were also defeated, but this is a Prime Earth Doom Patrol who are practically featless, and not the far more powerful Gerard Way Doom Patrol, who are part of a separate continuity and are not the same as the Prime Earth Doom Patrol. Dr. Manhattan would prove to be unstoppable until Superman finally confronted him. Only, things didn't go as Manhattan expected. Even after he told Clark that he was responsible for the death of his parents, Superman didn't resort to violence, instead protecting Manhattan. John had this false perspective that the darkness had to mean that either Superman killed him or that he destroyed everything. But Superman mentioned a third choice. Maybe it took everything Manhattan had to save this world and his own. After John was given this revelation, he completely reset the metaverse, recreating everything and undoing the death of Clark's parents, as well as several other events from the New 52 that aren't really worth talking about. He would then go on to return to the Watchmen universe and save it, erasing all of the nukes there, as well as getting rid of Ozymandias' strange alien creature he created. The story ends with Manhattan finally bestowing the last of his powers onto a child he named Clark. I do just briefly want to go over the Before Watchmen comic line and Doomsday Clock, which both Alan Moore and others working on the original Watchmen have sort of implied are, or could potentially not be canon. Now, I think they are still canon because they're both still licensed by DC, and it doesn't matter if Alan Moore doesn't like that, but regardless, I have separated out these two sections anyway, so it should be clear when Doomsday Clock feats are happening or when I'm talking about something that happened in Before Watchmen. So if you don't think either of those things count, then hey, I told you when it happened, so don't come complaining to me. Anyway, that will be it for now. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I will see you all in the next one.